I have seen this before. I have watched empires convince themselves that technology can overcome the brutal mathematics of war, and I have watched them crumble when reality finally strikes. It is currently 3 in the morning in Kyiv, and the city is not just dark, it is frozen in a silence that is louder than any siren. This is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a system that has just suffered a catastrophic terminal failure. Over the last 6 hours, we have witnessed what history will likely record as the opening salvo of the true winter offensive, a strategic pivot that the Western media is desperately trying to sanitize, but which you and I must confront with open eyes. The headline you are seeing on your screens that 137 Russian drones swarmed the capital is not the real story. The real story is what those drones represent and what they destroyed. They did not just strike a medical facility, though that is the tragedy the West will focus on to generate moral outrage. They struck the very idea that NATO air defense systems can protect a client state in a war of attrition. This was not a random attack, it was a stress test, and the Western shield cracked. Let's look at the hard reality on the ground. Stripped of the propaganda we are fed daily. 137 Giron, 2 drones, updated with thermobaric warheads and black radar-absorbing paint, flooded the airspace over the capital in 3 synchronized waves. This wasn't the clumsy, sporadic fire we saw in 2022. This was a sophisticated saturation swarm designed to overwhelm the engagement radar of the Patriot and Iris-T batteries stationed around the city. And it worked. The medical facility that was destroyed, a critical infrastructure node for treating combat trauma, was not hit because of a stray missile. It was erased because the air defense network was empty. It was out of ammunition. The multi-million-dollar interceptors provided by Washington and Berlin were baited into firing at cheap decoys, leaving the real killers to glide in untouched. This is the nightmare scenario that military realists have been warning about for 2 years. The economic asymmetry of modern warfare has finally collapsed the Western defense model. You cannot shoot down a $20,000 drone with a $4 million interceptor forever. Eventually, you run out of money, or you run out of missiles. Tonight, Kyiv ran out of both. To understand the gravity of this moment, we have to pull back and look at the historical arc. This is not an isolated tactical event. It is a Suez moment for American military hegemony. Just as the Suez Crisis of 1956 exposed the hollow core of British imperial power, this drone swarm has exposed the inability of the United States to guarantee the security of its proxies. For decades, the U.S. establishment has sold the world on the myth of technological invincibility. They told us that American engineering, the Iron Dome concept, and superior sensors would render conventional attacks obsolete. They built their entire foreign policy on the assumption that they could control the skies anywhere at any time. What we saw tonight was the death of that assumption. The Russians have adapted. They have industrialized drone warfare on a scale that the U.S. industrial base cannot match, let alone counter. When a swarm of 137 drones can plunge a European capital into darkness and destroy vital survival infrastructure despite the presence of the most advanced Western systems, the message to the rest of the world is clear. The emperor has no clothes. The security guarantee of the United States is written on paper that is rapidly burning. This brings us to the core thesis of what is happening right now. The destruction of this medical facility is horrific, yes, but in the cold calculus of geopolitics, it signifies a shift to total war. Moscow is no longer interested in performative strikes or negotiating leverage. This winter offensive is designed to freeze the Ukrainian state into submission by erasing the infrastructure necessary for biological survival. It is a siege tactic as old as the Romans, updated for the 21st century, and the West is powerless to stop it. Why? Because the United States is trapped in its own systemic hypocrisy. We are watching the inevitable decline of a hegemon that has overextended itself, fighting a proxy war on Russia's border, while its own domestic infrastructure crumbles and its debt spirals out of control. The establishment in Washington will try to spin this. They will talk about resilience and promise more aid packages. But you cannot print artillery shells, and you cannot print air defense capacity that simply does not exist in the warehouses. I want you to think about the psychological impact of this swarm. Imagine being a commander on the ground, watching your radar screen light up with over 100 targets, knowing you have only 30 interceptors left in your battery. That is the feeling of defeat. It is the same feeling the French had at Dien Bien Phu and the same feeling the Americans had in the final days of Kabul. It is the realization that the enemy has more will, more resources, and a better strategy. The Russians have moved beyond the initial blunders of this war and have settled into a grim, methodical rhythm of destruction that utilizes their greatest strength, mass. They are trading cheap motors and plastic for expensive Western electronics, and they are winning that trade every single night. The attack on the medical facility is a signal that there are no red lines left. If the infrastructure supports the state, it is a target. This is the brutal reality of war between industrial powers, something the West has forgotten because it has spent the last 20 years bombing shepherds in the Middle East who had no way to fight back. Now, they are facing a peer competitor, and the shock is palpable in every NATO capital. We must also recognize that this event accelerates the rise of the multipolar world. The global south is watching. India, China, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, they are all analyzing the data from tonight's attack. They are seeing that Western military hardware is not magic. It is fallible, expensive, and ultimately defeatable. This erodes the fear that underpins U.S. hegemony. If the U.S. cannot protect the sky over Kyiv, how can it protect the sky over Taipei, or Tel Aviv, or Seoul? The deterrence value of American power evaporates with every drone that finds its target. This is the unraveling. We are witnessing the physical manifestation of a geopolitical transition. The unipolar moment is dead, buried under the rubble of a medical facility in Kyiv, destroyed by a swarm of drones that cost less than a single cocktail party in Washington, D.C. This is the winter of our discontent, and the cold is just beginning to set in. As we move deeper into this analysis, we need to dissect exactly how the Western response failed, not just militarily, but economically and politically. We need to look at the panic that is quietly gripping the Pentagon as they realize their entire doctrine of air superiority is obsolete in the face of mass production. But the kinetic failure over Kyiv is merely the symptom of a much deeper, more malignant rot within the Western apparatus. To understand why 137 drones were able to darken the skies of a European capital, we must look beyond the battlefield and into the boardrooms of Washington and Brussels. We must examine the systemic failure of the greatest weapon the United States possesses, the weaponization of the global financial system. When this conflict began, the architects of American foreign policy promised us that sanctions would be the nuclear option of the 21st century. They told us that by cutting Moscow off from the SWIFT banking system and denying them access to Western semiconductors, the Russian war machine would grind to a halt within months. They arrogantly predicted that Russian missiles would soon be filled with dishwasher chips, if they could fly at all. Tonight's attack is the definitive refutation of that arrogance. The guidance systems inside those Duran 2 drones were not scavenged from washing machines. They were sophisticated, purpose-built electronics, many of which, ironically, were likely designed in California, manufactured in Taiwan, and shipped through a labyrinth of intermediaries that the U.S. Treasury Department is powerless to police. This brings us to the mechanism of circumvention, which is perhaps the most terrifying development for the establishment in Washington. The swarm that hit Kyiv proves that the blockade has failed. The global market is fluid like water. If you build a dam in one place, the capital simply flows around it. Russia has not been isolated. Instead, It has been integrated into a new parallel economy that operates entirely outside the purview of the G7. This is the gray market or the shadow fleet writ large. We are seeing a supply chain that runs through Central Asia, the Middle East, and undoubtedly China. The components for these drones traveled through a network of pragmatic nations that refused to sacrifice their own economic interests for the sake of American moralizing. Turkey, Kazakhstan, the UAE, India. These nations are not enemies of the West, but they are realists. They see a declining hegemon demanding loyalty it can no longer enforce, and they see a rising multipolar order that offers trade without political strings. They have chosen to facilitate the flow of goods because it is profitable and because they no longer fear the wrath of American sanctions. The fear is gone. This loss of fear is a direct result of the weaponization of the US dollar. By freezing $300 billion of Russian central bank assets, the United States crossed a Rubicon. They turned the global reserve currency into a tool of political coercion. In doing so, they signaled to every capital in the global south, from Brasilia to Riyadh to Jakarta, that their sovereign assets are not safe if they disagree with Washington's foreign policy. The reaction was predictable to anyone who studies history, yet it seems to have blindsided the State Department. The world began to de-dollarize. We are now seeing the rise of alternative payment systems, the expansion of BRICS, and trade settled in yuan or rubles or rupees. The drone swarm over Kyiv was paid for, sourced, and assembled in a financial ecosystem that the United States cannot sanction, cannot censor, and cannot control. This is the panic moment currently gripping the halls of the Treasury Department. They have pulled every lever, turned every screw, and yet the Russian military-industrial complex is producing more missiles and drones today than they were before the war started. The panic in Washington is compounded by the realization that they have deindustrialized their own economies while picking a fight with the world's factory. This is the arsenal of democracy myth colliding with the reality of financialized capitalism. For decades, the West outsourced its heavy industry, its smelting, its manufacturing, believing that services and finance were the future. They thought they could print money and buy security. But in a high-intensity attrition war, you cannot shoot a hedge fund at an enemy tank. You need steel. You need chemicals. You need engineers. Russia kept its factories. It kept its ability to surge production. The West did not. Now, we are in a situation where a consortium of autocracies, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and implicitly China, can outproduce the combined industrial output of NATO. The 137 drones that struck last night are just the tip of the spear. They represent a production capacity that is scaling up while Western stockpiles are winding down. This is a mathematical disparity that no amount of rhetoric from the White House can fix. Furthermore, we must analyze the target nation's resilience, or rather, the brutal breaking point of that resilience. The narrative in the West is that Ukrainians are superhuman, that their will is unbreakable. This is a cruel romanticization designed to sell the war to Western taxpayers. The reality, as evidenced by the chaos following this strike, is that no society can function without power, heat, and medical services. The circumvention of Western air defense has forced a grim pragmatism on the population. They are realizing that their government's promises of total victory are illusions. When the lights go out and the hospitals burn, the abstract concepts of democracy and sovereignty become very cold comfort. The resilience is cracking because the people realize they are pawns in a larger geopolitical game. They see that the West provides enough weapons to ensure the war continues, but never enough to win, and certainly not enough to protect them from freezing to death. This is the cynicism of the proxy war model. The host body is consumed to weaken the adversary, and this leads to the immediate reaction in Washington, behind closed doors, away from the podiums, where they read prepared statements about standing with Ukraine for as long as it takes. There is a frantic scramble. They know the Patriot systems are depleting. They know the production lines for replacements are years behind schedule. They are watching Russia conduct a masterclass in cost imposition strategy. Russia spends pennies to force the West to spend millions. It is an economic bleed out. The winter offensive is not just about taking territory in the Donbass, it is about bankrupting the Western coalition. Every time $1 million interceptor fires at a $20,000 drone, the U.S. gets weaker and its debt gets higher. The establishment is terrified because they have no plan B. Plan A was sanctions and regime change in Moscow. That failed. Now they are trapped in a loop of escalation that they cannot afford and cannot win, facing an adversary that has successfully insulated itself from their primary weapons of economic coercion. The panic is also driven by the silence of the neutrals. Washington expected the world to rally behind its moral crusade. Instead, the global South has shrugged. They look at the destruction in Gaza, backed by American bombs, and then they look at the condemnation of Russia, and they see only hypocrisy. This moral collapse facilitates the economic circumvention. Why should India stop buying Russian oil? Why should China stop selling dual-use components? They have no moral incentive to help the U.S. maintain its hegemony. The drone swarm is, in effect, a collaborative effort of the non-Western world, a physical manifestation of the emerging multipolar alliance that is united not by ideology, but by a shared desire to end the era of American unipolarity. The drones flying over Kyiv are the harbingers of a new world order, one where the U.S. dollar is just another currency, and the U. Navy is just another fleet. The shield is gone, and the empire is naked. If the economic failure described in the previous section is the skeleton of this disaster, then the moral failure is its rotting flesh. We must now confront the darkest aspect of the American imperial project, the moral trap. This is the mechanism by which the United States seduces nations with the siren song of democracy and security, only to lead them into the abattoir of great power conflict. The tragedy unfolding in Kyiv tonight, the darkness, the cold, the destruction of medical infrastructure is not merely the result of Russian aggression. It is the direct, inevitable consequence of a foreign policy that treats allied nations not as partners to be protected, but as disposable battering rams to be hurled against geopolitical rivals. The establishment in Washington loves to speak in high-minded platitudes about sovereignty and the rules-based international order. They cloak their actions in the language of human rights. But let us strip away the rhetoric and look at the ledger of history. What does it actually mean to be a strategic partner of the United States in the 21st century? It means you are the next Iraq. It means you are the next Libya. It means you are the next Syria. This is the historical pattern that the media refuses to acknowledge, yet it stares us in the face with blinding clarity. In 2003, we were told that invading Iraq was a moral imperative to plant the seeds of democracy in the Middle East. The result was not democracy, it was the total fragmentation of a society, the death of hundreds of thousands, and the birth of ISIS. In 2011, we were told that NATO intervention in Libya was a humanitarian responsibility to save Benghazi. The result? The wealthiest nation in Africa was turned into a failed state where human beings are literally sold in open slave markets today. In Syria, we armed rebels under the guise of freedom, only to prolong a civil war that destroyed the country and displaced millions. In every single instance, the United States arrived with promises of salvation and left behind a graveyard. The intent is irrelevant. The outcome is always chaos. And now, the same architects of those disasters, the same think tank experts and State Department careers have applied the same playbook to Ukraine. The moral trap works like this. Washington encourages a nation to take a hardline stance against a powerful neighbor, be it Russia or China, promising that the full might of the American military and economy will back them up. They encourage the rejection of neutrality. They encourage the rejection of compromise. They sabotage peace deals, just as the West reportedly blocked the Istanbul agreements in the early days of this war. They tell the client state, fight, and we will support you. But this support is always calibrated. It is enough to keep the war going, but never enough to win. It is enough to bleed the enemy, but not enough to save the proxy. This is the cynicism of the fight to the last Ukrainian doctrine. The goal was never Ukraine's safety. The goal was to give Russia its own Vietnam, to weaken Moscow's conventional forces at the cost of Ukrainian lives and infrastructure. The medical facility burning in Kyiv is collateral damage in a project designed to extend U.S. hegemony for another decade. The West is willing to sacrifice the biological survival of the Ukrainian people to achieve a geopolitical rounding error on the balance sheet of the Pentagon. We must also be brutally honest about the democracy promotion narrative. It is, and always has been, a guise for resource extraction and market expansion. This is the ugly truth that realists understand. When the dust settles, if it ever does, who will own what is left of Ukraine? BlackRock, JP Morgan, and massive Western agricultural conglomerates are already lining up. The reconstruction contracts are already being drafted. The push to integrate Ukraine into the West was never about the purity of the ballot box. It was about opening up a massive market for Western capital and securing the rich black earth of the steppe for Western agribusiness. The Ukrainian people are fighting and dying for their land, yes, but the geopolitical architects supporting them are fighting for their portfolio. This commodification of war creates a moral hazard where peace is actually bad for business. If the war ends, the aid packages stop. If the war ends, the urgent no-bid contracts for weapons production dry up. So the incentive structure in Washington favors prolongation, even if it means Kyiv freezes. This brings us to the ultimate betrayal, the falsity of the security guarantee. The United States has projected an image of omnipotence that it can no longer back up. By encouraging Ukraine to abandon the Minsk agreements and pursue NATO membership, the West wrote a check that its military-industrial complex could not cash. They promised a shield, but delivered a sieve. This is the deepest immorality of all. It is the immorality of the false prophet. To lead a nation down the path of total war against a nuclear-armed superpower, knowing full well that you will not intervene directly to save them, is a crime of historic proportions. We are watching the consequences of that crime in real time. The civilians huddling in the dark tonight are not victims of a lack of Western will. They are victims of Western delusion. They were sold a fantasy that NATO membership was a magic wand that would ward off Russian tanks. Instead, it was a red rag to a bull. The global South sees this trap clearly, which is why they refuse to join the sanctions regime. They look at the smoking ruins of the medical facility and they do not see Russian barbarism in a vacuum. They see the cost of trusting the West. They remember Afghanistan. They remember how the United States abandoned its allies in Kabul overnight, leaving them clinging to the landing gear of departing C-17 seconds. They know that when the political winds shift in Washington, when the polling numbers turn, the unwavering support will vanish like mist. The United States has no permanent friends, only permanent interests. And right now, the interest is to use Ukraine as a sponge to absorb Russian munitions. Once that sponge is saturated, once the utility is gone, the narrative will shift. We will start hearing op-eds in the New York Times about corruption in Kyiv, preparing the public for the inevitable abandonment. This is the moral rot at the heart of the empire. It is a system that devours its own children to feed its vanity. The drone swarm was a tactical event, but it revealed a strategic emptiness. We have nothing to offer the world but escalation. We have lost the ability to broker peace because we have forgotten the language of diplomacy, replacing it with the language of coercion. We demand submission, and when we don't get it, we arm the opposition and watch the country burn. But in Ukraine, the fire has gotten out of control. The weakening of Russia has backfired, creating a battle-hardened, militarized autocracy that is now angry and mobilized. And the victim, the true victim, is the innocent civilian in Kyiv who believed the lie that the West would save them. They are learning in the coldest way possible that it is dangerous to be America's enemy, but it is fatal to be America's friend. The fire burning in Kyiv is not just a local tragedy. It is the beacon fire of a global reckoning. It signals the definitive end of the post Cold War era and the beginning of a dangerous new chapter defined by asymmetric warfare and reciprocal escalation. What we witnessed with the drone swarm is the physical manifestation of a strategy that the global south, led by the Eurasian giants, has been perfecting for a decade. They have realized that they cannot compete with the United States in a direct contest of aircraft carriers or fighter jets, at least not yet. So they have changed the rules of the game. They have chosen to fight on the margins, using cost effective technology, economic leverage, and diplomatic maneuvering to bleed the American empire dry. This is the death by a thousand cuts strategy. And tonight, the cuts are deep. We must understand that this conflict has triggered a kinetic feedback loop. Every time the United States escalates, whether by sending long range ATACMS missiles or authorizing strikes deep into Russian territory, the response is not submission, it is reciprocal escalation. But the response does not always come in a form the Pentagon expects. It comes in the form of a drone swarm that paralyzes a capital. It comes in the form of Houthi rebels in the Red Sea shutting down global shipping lanes with cheap missiles, forcing the U.S. Navy to expend billions of dollars to protect commercial traffic. It comes in the form of sudden coups in the Sahel region of Africa, ejecting Western troops and welcoming Russian advisors. The West sees these as isolated incidents. The realist sees them as a coordinated global counteroffensive. The adversaries of the West are stretching American power thin, forcing it to be everywhere at once until it snaps. The most terrifying aspect of this reckoning is the consolidation of the Dragon Bear alliance, the strategic fusion of Russian military aggression and Chinese economic might. For decades, Western foreign policy grandmasters like Kissinger and Brzezinski warned that the ultimate nightmare for U.S. hegemony would be a union between Beijing and Moscow. The arrogance of current Western leadership has made that nightmare a reality. By sanctioning Russia, the West forced it into China's embrace. Now we face a symbiotic monster. Russia provides the raw resources, the combat experience, and the willingness to break things. China provides the industrial capacity, the dual use technology, and the financial lifeline. The components in those 137 drones, they are the fruit of this alliance. The West is no longer fighting a rogue state. It is fighting the combined industrial output of the emerging East. This is a war of attrition that the financialized economies of the West simply cannot sustain. This geopolitical tension is not abstract. It translates directly into a threat to your personal, national security, and economic stability. We are entering an era of permanent inflation. Why? Because the peace dividend is over. The cheap goods you enjoyed for 30 years were the product of a globalized order protected by U.S. naval dominance and fueled by cheap Russian energy. That order is gone. The drone strikes on infrastructure are a warning that supply chains are now targets. When energy infrastructure is destroyed, global oil and gas prices spike. When shipping lanes are threatened by asymmetric actors using drone technology, insurance premiums skyrocket, and the cost of everything from your coffee to your car goes up. Inflation is the tax you pay for the empire's foreign policy failures. The chaos in Ukraine is importing instability directly into your bank account. Moreover, the diplomatic mobilization of the global south represents a catastrophic failure of Western soft power. We are seeing the expansion of BRICS not just as an economic club, but as a geopolitical bloc that explicitly rejects the rules-based international order dictating from Washington. They see the U.S. seizing sovereign assets and weaponizing the dollar, and they are building a lifeboat. Nations like Saudi Arabia, once staunch U.S. Clients, are now hedging their bets, purchasing Chinese arms and hosting talks with Russian officials. They sense the shift in the wind. They see that the U.S. cannot even protect its most favored proxy in Europe from a winter blackout. If the U.S. cannot stop a drone swarm in Kyiv, how can it guarantee the security of the Persian Gulf? The perception of weakness is provocative. It invites challenge. We are standing on the precipice of a world where every regional power feels emboldened to settle old scores, knowing the global policeman is bankrupt and distracted. This leads us to the grim reality of blowback. The weapons we pour into this conflict do not simply vanish when they are used, they proliferate. The West has flooded Ukraine with advanced man portable air defense systems, anti tank weapons, and small arms. History tells us that in the chaos of a crumbling front, these weapons will migrate. They will end up on the black market. They will end up in the hands of terror groups, cartels, and insurgents in Europe and beyond. Just as the weapons sent to the Mujahideen in the 1,980 seconds were eventually turned against the West, the arsenal we are building in Eastern Europe will haunt us for decades. We are creating a hyper-militarized zone on the edge of Europe, awash in weapons, trauma, and radicalization. This is not enhancing our national security. It is planting a time bomb on our doorstep. The asymmetry of this warfare also exposes the vulnerability of our own societies. We live in glass houses, our power grids, our water systems, our financial data centers, they are all soft targets. We have watched Russia pound Ukraine's grid into dust, and we assume we are immune. But the technology to conduct these strikes is democratizing. If a state actor or a non-state proxy decided to employ similar swarm tactics against Western infrastructure, the results would be catastrophic. We have built brittle societies that rely on just-in-time delivery and continuous electricity. We are not prepared for the kind of survival mode that Kyiv is enduring tonight. The global reckoning is forcing us to confront the fact that our dominance was based on a technological gap that has now closed. The enemy has caught up, the moat is dry, and the walls are not as high as we thought. As we look toward the final conclusion of this analysis, we must accept that the old maps no longer apply. The world is fracturing into two distinct spheres: the Atlantic Rim, clinging to the fading glory of the past, and the Eurasian core, marching ruthlessly toward the future. The drone swarm was a message delivered in fire and shrapnel. The era of Western impunity is over. The consequences of ignoring this reality will not be measured in diplomatic communiques, but in the collapse of living standards and the erosion of safety at home. We are sleepwalking into a world of multipolar chaos, led by a political class that still thinks it is 1,999. They are wrong, and the price of their error is being paid right now in the freezing darkness of Kyiv. The darkness falling over Kyiv is merely the shadow cast by an empire entering its final eclipse. The events of the last 24 hours are not an anomaly. They are a historical verdict. We have arrived at the ultimate fork in the road, the moment that every hegemon eventually faces. On one side lies the path of adaptation, a path that requires humility, restraint, and the painful admission that the unipolar moment is gone forever. It requires Washington to accept that it can no longer dictate the political fate of nations on the other side of the world, that it cannot print its way out of debt, and that it cannot sanction its way to victory. This path offers survival. It offers a chance to retreat to a defensible position, to rebuild our crumbling domestic foundations, and to exist as a strong, sovereign nation among peers in a multipolar concert of powers. But there is another path, the path of illusion. This is the path of pride. It is the refusal to accept reality. It is the insistence that the laws of physics, economics, and history do not apply to the indispensable nation. It is the belief that if we just send one more aid package, sanction one more bank, or cross one more red line, the clock will turn back to 1991. Tragically, dangerously, the establishment in Washington seems locked onto this second path. They are clinging to the myth of exceptionalism like a drowning man clinging to a stone. They believe that because they are America, they cannot fail. But History is littered with the corpses of empires that believed they were chosen by God, right up until the moment the barbarians sacked the city. The Romans believed it, the British believed it, and now we believe it. The destruction of the medical facility in Kyiv is the result of this hubris. It is what happens when you prioritize the projection of power over the protection of life, when you value the image of strength over the reality of capability. The swarm of 137 drones serves as a cosmic irony. The most advanced military machine in human history is being dismantled by cheap, disposable technology. It is a metaphor for the entire geopolitical shift. The lean, hungry, and pragmatic nations of the global south are outmaneuvering the bloated, bureaucratic, and ideological West. We have spent trillions on aircraft carriers that are vulnerable to hypersonic missiles and billions on air defense systems that can be overwhelmed by lawnmower engines. We prepared for the war we wanted, not the war that exists. The winter offensive is forcing us to look in the mirror, and the reflection is not the shining knight of democracy we like to pretend we are. It is an aging giant, overextended, nearly bankrupt, and flailing against a changing tide. The tragedy is that the American people and the people of Europe never voted for this. They did not vote to impoverish themselves for a proxy war in the Donbass. They did not vote to risk nuclear escalation. This course was set by a detached elite who viewed geopolitics as a game of risk, played with other people's money and other people's blood. But the game is changing. The board is being flipped. As the lights go out in Kyiv, a different kind of light is dawning elsewhere in Moscow and Beijing and New Delhi. The center of gravity is shifting east. The West is becoming a peninsula of the Eurasian continent, isolated by its own arrogance. We must understand that the era of lecturing the world is over. The world is no longer listening. It is building, trading, and fighting on its own terms. This analysis is not defeatism, it is realism. It is the only antidote to the poisonous propaganda that has led us to this precipice. If we continue to believe the lies that victory is around the corner, that the Russian economy is collapsing, that the world is with us, we will continue to make catastrophic mistakes. We will sleepwalk into a direct conflict that we cannot win. The time for illusions is over. The cold reality is here. The question is no longer how we maintain our hegemony, but how we manage our decline without destroying the world in the process. If you are tired of the mainstream narrative that gaslights you into believing war is peace and defeat is victory, then you know what to do. This channel is a fortress for the realist perspective. We do not sell hope, we trade in hard truths. I need you to subscribe and turn on notifications because the algorithm suppresses this kind of analysis. We are building a community that sees the world as it is, not as the State Department wishes it to be. Share this video. Force the conversation. Now, I want you to go to the comments section and answer two questions that the media refuses to ask. First, do you believe the United States has the industrial capacity and the moral authority to lead the world? Or has that ship sailed? And second, is the destruction of Western-supplied air defense systems in Ukraine a temporary setback? Or is it the final proof that NATO technology is obsolete in a peer-to-peer war? I will be reading your answers. History is moving fast. Don't get left behind.